up here. Sorry.
Semplicemente una sciocchezza da parte dell'intervista, sono l'interprete, scusi. Sì. Mi diceva di fare un cenno, di dire tranquillamente quando mancano 2 o 3 minuti prima che scada il massimo di 40. Esatto, così prende e finisce. Mi diceva ad occhio massimo 40.
Yeah, okay.
Buon pomeriggio, grazie per essere intervenuti. Mi chiamo Marco Ferrari, sono un giornalista della rivista Focus, capo servizio scienza, ufficialmente. Faccio una piccolissima introduzione alla conferenza di Fort Denison, partendo da un mio ricordo personale, scusate le rimembranze. 3-4 anni fa ho cominciato a scrivere un libro che trattava delle conseguenze e dell'utilizzo dell'evoluzione darwiniana, diciamo così, classica, nella vita naturale. Ho cominciato a mettere su Google su qualsiasi cosa riguardasse l'evoluzione, mettevo Darwinian e poi aspettavo che il grande motore di ricerca che ci possiede tutti e che di tutto sa di noi potesse dirmi quello che mi interessava. L'unica persona che a quel tempo trattava in maniera divulgativa, in maniera piuttosto ampia, dell'agricoltura darwiniana era il qui presente Fort Denison. Ha scritto un libro molto bello, scritto benissimo, non tradotto in italiano, dico tra paradisi, che si chiama appunto Darwinian Agriculture, e in questa esposizione divulgativa, ma assolutamente perfetta, scientificamente correttissima ovviamente, l'autore ci racconta come i principi fondamentali scoperti da Darwin, ma poi complessificati, ampliati e chiariti negli anni successivi dai vari evoluzionisti, possano spiegare come e perché alcune cose che noi vorremmo potessero succedere nei campi non succedono. L'esposizione successiva del nostro ospite spiegherà con chiarezza come avvengono le cose, però tenete presente che è un approccio all'agricoltura assolutamente straordinario dal mio punto di vista, che non solo spiega perché non possiamo fare sempre quello che vogliamo. Gli esseri viventi, le piante in particolare, non sono plastiche, totalmente plastiche al nostro volere, ma anche e soprattutto perché conoscendo i principi dell'agricoltura darwiniana e non solo, sarebbe possibile andare nello stesso senso dell'evoluzione e avere allo stesso modo una produzione superiore che è quella che è necessaria per riuscire a sfamare tutti gli esseri viventi sul pianeta. Fort Denison rappresenta diciamo un picco di studi, c'è molta altra gente che sta occupandosi di questo argomento, si occupa in questo momento di simbiosi, cioè di vita in comune tra le leguminose e i batteri del genere Rhizobium, quelli che vivono nelle radici delle leguminose, fanno uno scambio alla pari di nutrienti tra piante e batteri. All'Università del Minnesota fa per la maggior parte ricerche su questo argomento, però quello di cui parlerò oggi saranno i principi generali dell'agricoltura darwiniana. La presentazione durerà circa una quarantina di minuti e alla fine sarà spazio per le domande. Vi prego di pensare a qualche domanda perché altrimenti io ne avrei moltissime e quindi vorrei cercare di stare il più zitto possibile perché mi do fastidio quando parlo, quindi do a voi la possibilità di fare tante domande. Please.
Thank you for the introduction, che non capisco. And thank you all for coming. I know there are a lot of activities going on today, so I'm glad that some of you were able to come and hear my talk. So I thought I should start with a picture of Charles Darwin, and I really like this one. It was sent to me by a farm advisor from California who took my book to the Galapagos Island with him and took this picture in front of the Charles Darwin Research Center there. Darwin was inspired by agriculture in developing his theory of evolution by natural selection. He knew that humans had started with wild plants like this, and in a relatively short time, 1 or 2 human lifetimes often, had given us this nice variety of vegetables, all starting from an ancestor like this. And so Darwin argued that given millions of years, similar processes could explain basically all of biology. But of course, the selection would be due to natural processes like cold or predators, not due to selection by humans. So since Darwin got ideas from agriculture, I thought it was only fair to return the favor and try to give agriculture some ideas from evolutionary biology. And I have training actually mainly in agriculture, but I've been working in evolutionary biology now for quite a few years. And today I'll have a couple of really just examples of how evolutionary biology could be applied to agriculture. The first is the problem of evolution of pests, and I will use the example of Xylella, but I have to warn you that I'm not an expert on Xylella, so treat this as an example. There may be practical reasons why the ideas I present would not be effective in controlling Xylella disease. And then the second example will be the problem of improving crop production, especially under conditions of global warming and resulting drought. But there are broader issues of crop production that I will discuss more in the book and briefly here. So really the question is, given that the wild ancestors of crops evolved under natural selection for millions of years, and during that time they were often exposed to drought, they were exposed to pests, their ability to survive under drought and with pests was improved already by millions of years of natural selection before humans domesticated these crops. And so the question then, what is left for us to improve with plant breeding or biotechnology? And actually quite a bit, I think, and I will discuss that. Okay, so first I'm talking about the Xylella disease, which is caused by bacteria. So I wanted to first give you an example of rapid evolution of microbes, because that's the problem we will face. We come up with some method to control these bacteria, but then they evolve. So how fast can microbes evolve? Well, we know that all life on Earth for the first billion years was single cells. It took 1 billion years or so for multicellular life to evolve. But we thought it might be possible to do this faster in the laboratory. And so what we did was to work with single-cell yeast, as the yeast that make bread or beer or wine, and we grew them in test tubes like this, shaking so they were suspended, but then once a day we would stop the shaking and let cells settle to the bottom of the tube. And then we would transfer just what settled into a new tube, and every day we would repeat that process. And you can see that we're getting more and more material settling in the tube here. And so after 14 days, which is much shorter than 1 billion years, right? After 14 days, we got these multicellular clusters because despite Galileo's famous experiments, in liquid, a cluster of cells settles faster to the bottom than single cells, which are held up by the friction. Now, we don't think this is what happened in nature, things that settled out. I'm really just using this as an example of rapid evolution. But we don't think this is what happened in nature. Things that settled to the bottom of the ocean didn't really have an advantage in nature. But one advantage that a multicellular cluster has, here we have dyed our single cells red color and you can see the red cells accumulating in the gut of this predator, whereas the clusters we dyed blue, and they're too big for the predator to eat. So that's rapid evolution of microbes. Now turning specifically to olive and Xylella, probably people know more about this than I do, but you know that it's killing olive trees, and the mechanism, the way that it kills the trees, is the Xylella makes this gum. It lives inside the plants, and it makes this gummy material which blocks the flow of water from the roots of the trees up to the leaves. And so the leaves dry out, as you can see here, and the plant dies. So there are various ways this might be controlled, but one way that's been suggested is that we know that there are other bacteria that live inside olive trees also, that can live inside olive trees also, that don't cause disease, and some of these make natural antibiotics which kill the Xylella bacteria. So that's been a suggestion as a possible way to control Xylella, would be to inoculate olive trees with these antibiotic-producing bacteria. I think this has possibility that it would work for a short time, but given the problem of evolution of the Xylella evolving, we have to worry that the Xylella would quickly evolve resistance to these antibiotics, and so the control might not last for a very long time. These translations are all by Google, so if some of them are funny, that's why. Right, so we know that the bacteria that cause human disease can quickly evolve resistance to our antibiotics, and many of our antibiotics are actually stolen from bacteria or fungi, or copied from bacteria and fungi, the things that the bacteria make to kill each other. Now, it's easy to understand that if you have a bacterium and it only takes one mutation, one small change to its DNA to become resistant to antibiotics, with millions of bacteria inside someone's body, there will be one that will have that mutation and they will evolve. But some of the cases of antibiotic resistance that we've seen in hospitals, they've actually done sequencing of the DNA and found that the antibiotic-resistant bacteria don't have just one change to their DNA that made them resistant, but actually 5 changes. And the chances of 5 changes to the DNA happening at once is, less than, it would take the life of the universe probably for that to happen. So they have to happen in sequence, one after the other. And so in this very interesting paper, they took the ancestor of these bacteria, which were easily killed by antibiotics. They took the population they found in the hospital, which was very resistant to antibiotics. And then they found that this had 5 different mutations that contributed to its antibiotic resistance. So they made all of these steps in between and analyzed what their Darwinian fitness, what their ability was to survive and reproduce given the presence of the antibiotics, and they identified 2 likely pathways, a series of 5 steps to get the antibiotic resistance. So that's what I would worry would happen with Xylella with the natural antibiotics. Now, we could hope that when the Xylella here evolves resistance to the antibiotic, that our beneficial good bacteria here will also evolve and make a new version of the bacteria that will kill the Xylella. The question is, can we be confident that that will happen? Well, if the only bacteria inside the plant was Xylella and these good bacteria that we put in, and if it's very important to the survival of the good bacteria that they kill Xylella because they're competing very strongly or because they're eating Xylella, then probably when the Xylella evolves resistance, the good bacteria also will evolve and continue to kill the Xylella. But we think there are many bacteria inside the olive, and so if the main competitors of these good bacteria are not Xylella but other bacteria, then the evolution of the beneficial bacteria may be mostly controlling these others and not necessarily controlling Xylella. Because, for an individual bacterial cell, it doesn't really matter if the tree lives or dies. They have evolution has a very short view of time. So I'm suggesting, just as an example, an alternative approach, and that is, we know that there are bacteria which make enzymes that will actually break down this gum. Now, if that's just a side effect of the bacteria's life, then that's not necessarily any better than the other approach. It might not last very long. But we could take bacteria that we know can live inside olive, modify them in the laboratory, perhaps with biotechnology, perhaps with directed experimental evolution, evolve them so that the only food they can eat is this gum. And then they break down the gum, they eat it, the water now can flow from the roots up to the leaves, and if the Xylella evolves so that its gum has a different structure, because that's the only food for this beneficial bacteria, a rare mutant that can break down it, the new version of the gum will spread through the tree and we will get continued control. Again, I don't know, there may be practical reasons why this wouldn't work, but it's an example of how an evolutionary biologist might think about solving a pest problem in a way that provides not just short-term control, but sustainable long-term control. Now let me go back to the improvement of plants and the question, given millions of years of evolution, what's left for us to improve? And I have some really nice examples of what natural selection can do in just a few thousand years to illustrate, of course, much more would be improved over millions of years. So here's my example. This is barnyard grass, which is a weed. This is watergrass in the middle, which is a weed that grows it's a serious weed in rice fields. And we know from analysis of their DNA that watergrass evolved from barnyard grass. And we also know, because rice fields have not been so widespread for very long, we know that this evolution happened perhaps in as little as 2,000 years, certainly in only a few thousand years. This was evolution that happened in rice fields, not in natural settings. So what changes happened in this barnyard grass when it evolved to watergrass in just a few thousand years? The first change, you see that barnyard grass has a red stem. So a farmer goes out to the rice fields, they see green rice plants, they see a red-stemmed plant, and they run over there and remove that plant right away. And so when barnyard grass first invaded rice fields, it had no chance to survive until a green mutant appeared, and then they were the only ones that survived. And soon all of them were green in the rice fields. Now this green stem would have been enough to fool me, because I'm not an expert on rice, but people that work with rice all the time noticed, of course, other small differences between the weed and their rice plants. And so they kept removing every plant from their field that didn't look like rice. Until in 1983, watergrass looked more like rice than like its own ancestor from only a few thousand years ago. Now compare this to what biotechnology has done, and tell me which you think is more difficult. Looking like rice was not the only challenge that watergrass had to face in rice fields, because barnyard grass, like many other plants, is killed by flooding. It can't get oxygen down to its roots. And so here we have rice fields at the University of California, where I taught crop ecology before going to Minnesota. Here we have rice in deep water, solid dark green because there are no weeds growing there. Here we have shallow water where the yellow-green is weeds that are able to survive in the shallow water. And so when barnyard grass first invaded rice fields, it could only grow at the edge of the field where the water was shallow. But over a few thousand years, it also evolved these air-filled channels that let the oxygen move down from above the water down to the roots in the wet soil. And it evolved this layer of cells that keeps the oxygen from leaking out before it gets to the roots. Now today, of course, we also use chemical pesticides to control weeds in rice. And so in this picture, each of the vertical columns is sprayed with a different pesticide except for the control in the middle. This is all watergrass. And in the front two rows, we have watergrass from two organic farms where they were not sprayed with herbicides, and you can see that there the watergrass was easily killed. But in the back two rows, we have watergrass from two conventional farms where they used herbicides, and they're highly resistant now to herbicides. And there are cases for this weed. Presumably there were a small number of plants, 1 in a million, that was a mutant resistant to herbicides, but they can go from not noticeable in a field to covering the field in as little as 3 years. So plant evolution can be very, not as fast as bacteria or yeast, but still can be very fast. Here's more examples of evolution of herbicide resistance. Now, I want to emphasize, whenever I talk about evolution of insecticide resistance, herbicide resistance, people who use herbicides and pesticides, get unhappy and say, oh, he's against conventional agriculture. But no, this is not an argument about organic farming or pesticides, because evolution of pests affects everything we try to do to control pests, not just those that are based on chemicals. I've already given you the example of hand hoeing by farmers and of flooding, but I really like this example. So one of the ways that both conventional and organic farmers control pests is crop rotation, where in 1 year they'll grow maize, and then in this same area the next year they'll grow soybean. They'll grow soybean here, and the next year they'll grow maize, back and forth between these two, usually with much larger fields than this, so that the pests that do well in corn will die out in the soybean year. The pests that do well in soybean will die out in the corn year. And so this was used effectively to control a pest insect called corn rootworm. And it worked well for a while. They would lay their eggs in the corn. The eggs would sleep during the winter. They would hatch in the spring, look for corn. There's no corn, only soybeans. They can't eat soybeans, so they would die, and the pests would die out. But 1 insect in a million was a mutant that had a 2-year life cycle. They slept through the soybean year and didn't hatch until corn was again grown in the field. And the article about this, there's a famous book about sailing and whales and so on called 2 Years Before the Mast. The article about this was called 2 Years Before the Hatch. So I thought it was a clever title. Anyway, pests will evolve. I just learned about this on a recent speaking trip at the University of Pennsylvania. So when Monsanto introduced, I have to say, in case anybody's wondering, I think that glyphosate or Roundup is a very safe herbicide. Now that means that we want to be able to use it for a long time, okay? So Monsanto in 1996 introduced Roundup Ready soybean that was resistant to glyphosate, so farmers could use glyphosate for controlling weeds. They could use less tillage, and of course tillage tends to destroy the soil, so this is a kind of a good thing environmentally, especially where erosion was a problem. And at first they didn't have any corn that was resistant to glyphosate. So the rare weeds that were resistant to glyphosate would start to build up in the soybean where they were using glyphosate as the only weed control, but then they had the corn year and they would use a different herbicide and the resistant mutants would die out. And so I talked to a dean at University of Pennsylvania, Penn State University, who told people at Monsanto, don't make Roundup Ready corn, because then you will have people using glyphosate all the time and you will get resistant weeds. But apparently they didn't listen. In 2 years they introduced glyphosate-resistant corn, and so now we have Roundup Ready corn in the front, and in the back, taller, Roundup Ready giant ragweed, which is a serious weed that's resistant to Roundup because the farmers were using Roundup or glyphosate every year. Okay, so now turning to opportunities for crop improvement. Because the ancestors of crops were improved for millions of years for drought resistance, pest resistance, and so on, before they were domesticated by humans, some of the things that we think we might be able to improve probably are already so improved by evolution that there's not much opportunity. But there are, I think, many cases where the ability of past evolution, of past natural selection to improve traits like drought tolerance was limited by various compromises or trade-offs. And in some cases, those trade-offs still apply to agriculture today, but in other cases, they're trade-offs that we can accept in agriculture even though they were rejected by natural selection. And that's really the main topic of my book. My book is not mostly about pesticides or pesticide resistance. So the easiest trade-off to understand would be trade-offs between past conditions and present conditions. And so I'll use the example that if there are trade-offs linked, the carbon dioxide today in the atmosphere is much higher than it was when the ancestors of our crops or when our early domesticated crops were evolving. Big change. So what are the implications of this? Well, it turns out that there's a trade-off between the efficiency of photosynthesis at high CO2, which is this axis, and the importance of the ratio of CO2 to oxygen, which is this axis. Any kind of a negative line like this between this is good, but if you have a high value of this, you have a low value of this, and so on. So that's the trade-off line. And back in 1999, biotechnology people tend not to pay attention to trade-offs. Maybe if they read my book, they would. But they noticed that for this trait, this specificity trait, red algae were better than our crops. You can see a trade-off in the crops as well. And so they said, look, we'll put the red algae genes into crops and we will have 3 times more efficient photosynthesis. But I pointed out a long time ago this trade-off, and it turns out that this has been analyzed recently in light of the increasing CO2 and they found that actually, because CO2 is higher today, this specificity for CO2 is no longer as important as it was in the past, whereas this rate of activity of the enzyme, which gives you the efficiency at high CO2, that is increasingly important. And so they calculated that actually we should go in the opposite direction, change our crop enzyme to be more like these bacteria, the opposite direction from what biotechnology was calling for in 1999. Unfortunately, they're estimating only a 3% increase, which is relatively small. I think, though, that the biggest area for improvement involves compromises or trade-offs between the competitiveness of individual plants, the ability of individual plants to steal water or nitrogen or light from their neighbors, a trade-off between that and how well a plant community work together to produce the food that we need. And of course, natural selection is all about the individual, not the community. Let me give first a short example. The male flowers of maize up here at the top collectively as a community produce much more pollen than is needed to fertilize all of the female flowers which make the corn grain that we eat. And there's a cost to the community because first this flower itself, because it's too big, takes a lot of carbon, takes a lot of nitrogen that could have been used to make grain, and also they cast shadows which reduce the photosynthesis of the plants underneath. So, plant breeders have been improving this trait. If I'd taken this picture 60 years ago, this shadow would have been much bigger. But millions of years of natural selection, why didn't they improve this trait and make the flowers small enough just to provide enough pollen for all the female flowers? Well, here's a hint. It's the same reason that natural selection didn't make the antlers of the Irish elk smaller at the time that the Irish elk was going extinct, because their antlers were getting caught in trees and they couldn't escape from predators. Even while the species was going extinct, male elk with big antlers got to mate and had babies, and those who had smaller antlers didn't get to mate. So too bad for the species. And the same thing for many traits in plants. Now, I'm not the first person to talk about these trade-offs between individuals and community. The most brilliant paper on this was published by Colin Donald, just a wonderful, wonderful paper cited in my book. And he said there's this trade-off between individual plant competitiveness and whole crop yield, and we need to select for whole crop yield. And they had a whole list of ideas, of which I'm only giving two here. First, the plant should be short so that they put their energy into grain, not into making taller stems to get above their neighbor. And second, they should have erect or vertical leaves so that you can squeeze more plants into the same area and get more yield per hectare. Now, brilliant paper, as I was saying, but since after my book was published, I discovered this paper by a plant breeder, Peter Jennings, who had the same ideas before Colin Donald's, these two ideas at least, before Colin Donald's great paper. And so he then took his ideas and said, I'm going to make a rice plant that is short and has vertical leaves, and I think this will be a high-yielding plant. And so this is the result, IR8, surrounded by its two parents, both of which are taller. And this doubled the yield of rice in just, basically overnight. So here we have rice yield, nitrogen fertilizer rate. This is the typical old variety. At low nitrogen, there's no benefit to the new variety, but there's also no trade-off, no cost. But if you add nitrogen fertilizer or some other source of nitrogen like manure, the yield goes down in the old varieties because the plants fall over, their heads are too heavy. Whereas with fertilizer and this short variety with erect leaves, you can get 10 megagrams per hectare instead of 5, which is the most that could be achieved with the old variety. Now, this saved 1 billion people from starving to death, but Colin Donald, if you'd asked him, he's dead now unfortunately, would have said yes, but I bet there's a trade-off with competitiveness. And I don't know why Jennings didn't get the Nobel Prize along with Norman Borlaug. He actually did this experiment. He said, let's put my new rice in competition with the old lower yielding varieties and see how well it does in competition. And here's how well it does in competition. It disappears in 4 years of competition with the low yielding materials. Now, this was actually anticipated by Sunison back in 1949 with barley, the same thing. Low yielding varieties are more competitive and displace high yielding varieties, assuming that both varieties have the same weather tolerance and that sort of thing. Okay, now turning to climate change, this prediction I found on the web, increased drought in Italy with yield losses of perhaps 15%, perhaps up to 25% in areas. And so this obviously is a problem because we have growing population, all the things that were talked about the other night. So biotechnology and seed companies have been working on this problem, and here is their progress so far. Yield here of an old variety and a so-called drought-tolerant variety from Monsanto. Similar data for Pioneer. You don't see real benefit in the Pioneer material, although they have higher yields than Monsanto's. But one thing I need to point out is that these data come from an independent test by people who didn't get money from Monsanto, from Pioneer, whereas these data come from Monsanto scientists. But let's assume that this 6% is accurate. 6% is not really very good compared to 100%. The increase that was achieved through the method that I suggest, which is looking at these trade-offs between individual and community. Now, what about these benefits? Do they involve a trade-off between individual and community? Well, I got some data from papers from Pioneer scientists and Monsanto scientists, and both of these graphs are soil water, and here we have this critical period for maize growth where water drought is a serious problem. And you see that what they're calling drought tolerant is actually growing in wetter soil than the old variety. For both Pioneer and Monsanto, they're not drought tolerant, they're in wet soil. Why are they in wet soil? It's side by side, good experiment. They're in wet soil because the so-called drought tolerant did not use as much water early in the season, left it in the soil to use it in this critical period. Well, these scientists did this in only a few years. Why couldn't natural selection do this in millions of years? I hope some of you have the answer, that a plant that leaves water in the soil to use later, that water will be used by one of its competing neighbors. It won't have it later. That's in nature, where you have many different genotypes growing side by side, competing with each other. But often in modern agriculture, we have plants that are either all the same genotype or at least have similar behavior with respect to water use. And so there, you can have a whole field of plants that all save water together so that they can all use it together later in the season. Well, that's 6%. Can we do better than 6%? I think actually we can do quite a bit better than 6%. And here's why I think so. So many of you probably know that the water used by plants, the water vapor, is going out through these stomatal pores in the leaves. At the same time, the carbon dioxide is coming in. So there's kind of a built-in trade-off between water use and the photosynthesis that gives us our crop yield. But the ratio between photosynthesis and water use is low if the air has high humidity, lots of water vapor in the air, and if the temperature is cool. Whereas this same ratio, so-called water use efficiency, this ratio is only 25% as high in the afternoon when the air is much drier and temperatures are hotter. Much more water is used for the same amount of photosynthesis. So my suggestion for cases where we don't have irrigation, where we have drought, or where irrigation water is very expensive, that we should look at the possibility of plants that take a nap in the afternoon, a siesta, close their stomata at least part way during the time of day when they're getting very little photosynthesis relative to their water use. Save that water to use it in the morning when they can get much more photosynthesis and growth and yield from the same amount of water. This is essentially my last slide, so we're good. Why did natural selection not do this? The same reason. A plant that saves water in the morning, in the afternoon, to use it in the morning, that water would be taken by a competitor. But with a whole field of plants that are all doing this, they can all save water in the afternoon and all use it more efficiently in the morning. So to summarize, any kind of pest control, we need to think about sustainability. We need to think about how the pests will evolve in response to flooding or hand hoeing or herbicides or biological control. And in a particular case for Xylella, something that can only eat Xylella gum, I think would be effective. It wouldn't kill the Xylella, but it would let the water flow to the leaves, and it would evolve to continue that behavior. And then for drought, natural selection has not made crops share water in a cooperative way, but we could do that through plant breeding or biotechnology. And I'll close just with a picture of wild rice near my home in Minnesota. If you look carefully, you see that wild rice grows as a monoculture, just one species. And if you want to know that story, you'll have to read my book. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Grazie infinite. Non rubo tempo alle domande perché io sono rimasto assolutamente affascinato dalla presentazione e consiglio a tutti, se qualcuno ha voglia di allargare e di approfondire l'argomento, di acquistare il libro, tanto ovviamente su Amazon eccetera è possibile acquistarlo quando e come si vuole. Ci sono alcune parole fondamentali nella presentazione che sono il compromesso, trade-off e la cooperazione. E con questo, conoscendo, come dicevo all'inizio, conoscendo queste parole, conoscendo l'applicazione di queste parole all'agricoltura, sarebbe possibile in una maniera molto più complessa. In una maniera molto più complessa di quanto non avvenga adesso, probabilmente molto più difficile riuscire ad avere una produzione elevata, ma che duri per molto tempo. Qualcuno ha domande da fare? Noi, anzi no, io no. Ok, là.
Buonasera, volevo fare una domanda su Xylella. Ho letto alcuni studi scientifici condotti in Texas sulla possibilità di utilizzare dei virus batteriofagi per attaccare il batterio, quindi dei batteriofagi selezionati appositamente per colpire i ceppi di Xylella fastidiosa. C'è però il problema che, dato che il batterio può essere contenuto anche in altre piante come il serbatoio, una situazione simile potrebbe attenuare una epidemia di Xylella ma non risolvere alla radice, perché gli insetti vettori potrebbero continuamente spostare il batterio da una pianta all'altra anche dopo un intervento di successo. Vorrei chiedere al professor Denison se pensa che la strategia dei batteriofagi possa essere molto significativa, oppure se richieda necessariamente altre forme di lotta integrata in associazione.
Well, I've already said that I'm not an expert I've already said that I'm not an expert on Xylella. I'm also not an expert on bacteriophage. I've always wondered about the use of bacteriophage therapy in controlling human disease. From an evolutionary point of view, because the phage are actually dependent on essentially eating, reproducing inside the bacteria, it seems like it would solve the problem that as the Xylella evolves, the bacteriophage would evolve to continue to control the Xylella. I'm not sure I understand the other part of your question. I know that Xylella causes problems in many other crops, not just in olives, but that seems to me a benefit that I don't know of any case where Xylella is beneficial to plants. So if you use bacteriophage for controlling Xylella in olives, and then that bacteriophage spreads to California, and I don't know if you have Xylella problem in grapes here, but if it spreads to grapes and controls Xylella disease in grapes, either here or in California, or it spreads to orange trees in Brazil and controls Xylella in Brazil, I think the rest of the world would probably thank Italy for doing that.
Altre domande? Ok, prego.
Sì, buonasera. Mi sembra che nella presentazione si è parlato più che altro di evoluzione delle vegetale, se non ho capito male. Volevo capire se ci sono anche studi per manipolare direttamente gli aggressori delle coltivazioni. Avevo letto tempo fa di un'azione che è stata fatta in Brasile, forse anche nel sud degli Stati Uniti, sulle zanzare che trasmettono il dengue. Cioè venivano rilasciate zanzare geneticamente modificate che diciamo erano sterili, quindi impedivano poi la riproduzione delle zanzare che poi trasmettevano il dengue. Volevo capire se c'erano altre ricerche in questo campo, cioè per manipolare l'evoluzione dei parassiti.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. That's actually an old technique for controlling some insects that attack cattle, where before biotechnology they would make sterile males using radiation, release them, they would mate with the females would not mate again, but they wouldn't produce any offspring. Certainly the mosquito stuff is very interesting. I'm not an expert on that, but I know that there are some concerns, for example, with malaria, that if you get humans that are bitten by malaria mosquito get resistance for a limited amount of time, and so depending on the timing of how various control methods are released, there is a possibility to make things worse. But as I say, I'm not an expert on that, and I do think the thing has potential. I would like to mention, though, a different kind of manipulation, not genetic manipulation, but actually manipulation of behavior. So the wild potato has little hairs on its leaves, and when an insect brushes against those hairs, they release a chemical which is the same gas that the insects use to tell each other that a dangerous predator is in the vicinity. And so the insects brush against these wild potato leaves, and they get very frightened and they go away. This was discovered by scientists at the Rothamsted Research Station in England, and more recently they've actually genetically modified wheat to do this same thing. This was unfortunately attacked by anti-GMO people, so they don't have complete results. I think the approach, the general approach seems very interesting and promising. The thing you have to think about, though, is it's very different if one plant scares away insects, but if you have a whole field that's all doing the same thing, then maybe you have a few insects that are not frightened of that chemical, and they're the only ones that reproduce in that field. So I think the people at Rothamsted would benefit from talking to evolutionary biologists in designing their experiments. But I do think in general that both guiding the evolution, well, this is going to be a long answer, but maybe it'll be interesting. In my own work, I'm interested in the beneficial bacteria that provide nitrogen to plants. These would be soybean, alfalfa, and so on. And these bacteria are pretty good, but they're not as good as they could be. And so two things we're working on. One is, can we develop plants that manipulate the evolution of these beneficial bacteria so that only the most beneficial ones persist, and therefore every year the plants are getting more nitrogen from these bacteria. We think there's a possibility to double the amount of nitrogen they're getting, and this would really decrease the amount of nitrogen fertilizer that would be used. Well, that's genetic manipulation, like domestication of plants or animals where we actually change the DNA of the plants. The other kind of manipulation would be like taming, where you have some wild animal that's not genetically different from anything else, but you can make it friendly with people by feeding it or something like that, like my wife does with squirrels. The plant version of that, taming, how do you tame an apple tree? Well, you graft on a root that makes it grow only this tall, and it makes it easier to pick the apples. We could do that genetically so that the plant would do that without grafting. That would be like domestication. So I think both versions of those are very interesting, and thank you for answering that question, or asking that question.
Credo che non ci sia più molto tempo, qualche minuto c'è. Io volevo fare una domanda, perché altrimenti poi non ho più occasione di farla. È possibile applicare, oltre ai principi dell'evoluzione, anche alcune, tra virgolette, leggi dell'ecologia all'agricoltura, in modo da avere un approccio ancora più globale, ma ancora più complesso di quanto non sia stato fatto fino adesso?
We should, of course, apply the laws of ecology. Dave Tillman, who's a big advocate of diversity in agriculture, is a member of my department at the University of Minnesota. He might be the world's most famous ecologist. I think crop diversity is really important, but I think the most important crop diversity is global diversity, where we are relying on corn, maize, wheat, and rice for the vast majority of our food, either directly or through feeding animals. So if we get a pest that destroys the world wheat crop, we'll have 1 billion people die of starvation. So that's, on a global scale, I think it's very important to have many, many more crops grown. On a regional basis, it's also important. When ecologists talk about this, they're really often talking about diversity on a smaller scale, that you're growing mixtures of plants. And there, I think they have results well, it's a very strange thing. This experiment, that's the most famous experiment in Minnesota, they have published data showing much higher productivity where they have 16 species compared to where they have only 1 species. So I was impressed by that until I went and visited the site. And then I saw that the plots that have only one species have big soil between the plants. They have only 60% plant cover. They've actually published that once. That's only 60% plant cover versus 100%. So that's why they have low productivity, is they have so much bare soil. So the question is, why is there so much bare soil? Because if you look at natural ecosystems that only have one species, like the wild rice that I showed, they don't have, bare soil like that. So I worry a little bit that when they send out all of these undergraduate students to pull out the weeds in the 16 species plot, everything looks like it probably belongs there, so they don't pull anything out. But in the one species plot, they're pulling out everything that doesn't look like the one species, and maybe accidentally they're pulling out the one species as well. So yes, we should apply principles of ecology, but let's make sure those principles are accurate.
Ok, grazie, abbiamo finito, c'è una prossima conferenza, quindi dobbiamo concludere. Spero che questo assaggio, è veramente un assaggio dell'applicazione dei principi dell'evoluzione e, come abbiamo visto alla fine, dell'ecologia anche all'agricoltura, possa essere utile. Non sarà un percorso facile, ma sarà un percorso assolutamente indispensabile da compiere se vogliamo continuare ad avere una produttività elevata. Grazie, grazie ancora.
Thank you very much. All right, thanks a lot.